All right. That is all from us. I'm sure you are extremely disappointed to hear that. And we will bring up Tarfia Faizullah.
Hi, everybody. So ever since I saw Chelsea read, I have been dying to also take my shoes off, so I'm going to do that first. Thank you for the inspiration, Chelsea. I'm really hoping that one of these falls over during my talk. Okay, so my first year in graduate school, one of my classmates wrote "weak line break" beside almost every single line of one of my poems for workshop. I don't remember what poem it was, but I will never forget how it felt to really consider, the line break as though for the first time. I'm not sure I ever really had up until that point. I came to writing poetry in earnest through grief, though there are a few other villain origin stories that I won't get into here. But before the tragedy that led me to poetry, I had been writing short stories, had even begun a novel. I share this to say that my awareness of the line break was purely intuitive and largely emotional. Because I was shattered, so too the sentence had to be. But now I was in graduate school, and apparently, according to my classmate, my relationship with the line needed to be deepened, at the very least reconsidered. And I'm serious when I say literally next to every single line, I was like, weak line break. He really put his back into it. And I have to say, I wasn't offended by my classmates' response. Quite the contrary, the anaphora actually made me laugh with the delight of someone who has finally been given the permission, which is the artist's colleague and catalyst, to extend and excavate my relationship to an aspect of poetry I had been dancing around. I really feel grateful to him for being the first person to point out what immediately seemed so obvious, which is that there is such a thing as a line. Which means there is such a thing as a line break, and if it could be weak, that meant it could also be strong. And that began what I think may just be an obsession that will be lifelong. Rhyme unintended, but allowed to stand. During that time, I had a couple of other encounters that informed or redirected, I should say, the way I began to think about the line. One was with Ellen Bryant-Voigt, who told us during a visit about an experience she'd had while putting together her new and selected. During the editing process, somehow all of the poems for that book had come to her unlineated, and she decided to task herself with seeing whether or not she could or would break the line now differently than she had before, or in the same way, without looking at the original lineation. I can't recall whether the answer to that was yes or no, but it did show me that a poet's relationship to line is both deliberate and often its own kind of record about where a poet may be in space and time. And speaking of time, of course, we know the poetic line is its own kind of timestamp. We think already of the line break as a way to create pacing, as a way to pause, and as a performance of silence. Honestly, I'm not quite sure what I mean by performance of silence, since I'm revisiting that phrase now. I wrote that originally at 2 a.m., but I think I mean that but I think what I mean is that the line can serve as an effect that gestures towards what remains unsaid, both what cannot be said and what can only be said with silence. Which brings me to another memorable encounter I had with the line during grad school, this time with Jean Valentine. Valentine, and I should say that both Ellen Bryant-Voigt and Jean Valentine were visiting writers doing a reading and a Q&A with us. Valentine told us that Emily Dickinson had been criticized for not writing directly about the Civil War in her poems. But what about the M-dash, Valentine said, such explosions, a way to convey the horror of the bombs and war that was happening all around. Not only did this blow my mind to consider, forgive this pun, it also showed me that the line works in concert with other technical tools, such as punctuation, white space, and rhyme, to deepen and enhance its effects. As I've said, we're familiar with line break as a tool for pacing, a kind of score that teaches us how to read the poem both textually and for meaning and aloud, but to Valentine's point, the line break is symbolic as well as sonic, and most intriguingly, as a kind of subversive. The line break is a literal break, a kind of shattering not unlike the one that led me to poetry in the first place. In this way, it is no coincidence that so many turn to poetry specifically to say what is ineffable. I was speaking to a person this morning at the hospitality shop who was saying that we need poetry now more than ever, and of course, as a poet, I love to hear it, but I also strongly agree with her. And so it is no coincidence that so many turn to poetry for what is ineffable, and those turns created by the line can also be seen as a kind of rupture, a kind of disruption, a kind of disturbance, not to mention destruction of many sorts, including linear, i.e. capitalist, time. To break a line is not to just slow down or to create a score by which a poem may be read, but also to both honor and to feel some sense of malleability over the maddening consistency and chaos of time. Okay, let's geek out now. So how this is going to go, I'm going to share some quotes from people who have thought about the line already, and then I'm going to walk us through a couple of poems that I think use line breaks to interesting effects. Okay, I'm going to try to make this just a little bit bigger. George Oppen says, the meaning of a poem is in the cadences and the shape of the lines and the pulse of the thought which is given by those lines. Christina Davis says, I've come to respect that the line break can be a kind of litmus to test the intentional dimensions of the whole. It samples and resamples the acoustical contours of the line, varies the line's visual and architectural blueprint, reconfigures the poem's vertical and horizontal landscape, interrupts or reestablishes the underlying meter, stress, breadth of the line, and of course, confirms or alters the line's semantic life. Even if we revert to the original line, each time we break a line during revision, we get a better understanding of the manifold potential of the poem. Yet there is at our disposal no tool of the poetic craft more important, none that yield more subtle and precise effects than the line break, if it is properly understood. Denise Levertov. James Longenbach, who of course famously wrote The Art of the Line, says, poetry is the sound of language organized in lines. Mary Oliver, prose is printed or written within the confines of margins, while poetry is written in lines that do not necessarily pay any attention to the margins, especially the right margins. Kim Adenizio and Dorianne Luck say, think of line breaks as effects, learn the different effects you can achieve, and then decide which you want. And William Carlos Williams, who I will talk a little bit more about later, says, our poems are not subtly enough made. The structure, the staid manner of the poem cannot let our feelings through. So as I started to think about the line break, I decided to ask, the God that is Google, for help here. And I came across this article by one Hannah Huff, who seems to feel very strongly that there are absolutes when it comes to line breaks. And I was fascinated by this. I'm going to be shady about Hannah Huff all the way through this. If you know Hannah Huff, just let her know. Just let her know. So Hannah Huff says, never end a poetic line on an article. She also says, never end a poetic line on a conjunction. She also says, never end a poetic line on a pronoun. I love this next one. Try really hard not to end a poetic line on a preposition. She doesn't say never do it, but she says try really hard not to. She also says line break on unusual nouns and verbs that ring strong as standalone words. Yeah, sure. Fair enough, I guess, Hannah, fair enough. However, be aware that enjambment can rejuvenate common, tired words like no other poetic device. I'm not sure about the part about no other poetic device, but also fair enough. Line break at a rhythmic point to poise meaning and weave a sonic tapestry. She says, luckily poetry has shed its rhyming knickers, which I won't even go on here, but you get a sense of, I think I read this and I was just sort of like, what is she talking about? But I thought it was useful to sort of think about the fact that there are these sorts of, the line break, like other poetic devices, sort of come with this, you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way. These are the only ways to do it. I would argue, of course, against that. Again, if you know Hannah, tell her I say what's up. In this lecture, I'm not going to really talk about meter. I'm not going to really talk about it, but I feel like it's important to at least acknowledge it in a lecture where we're talking about the line. So here are a few bits from John Rylander, who says, by creating a line which contains extra unstressed syllables, the poet can reinforce effects of rapidity, lightness, ease, or conversational naturalness. By creating a line which contains stressed syllables without the normally intervening unstressed syllables, the poetic can reinforce effects of slowness, weight, difficulty, tension, or intensity, and a pronounced reversal in the rhythm of the line usually signals an important movement in the development of the poem. That's for all of you metric geeks out there. You're welcome. But again, while it's important, that's not the focus of this lecture. But so some of what I just shared, some of those are the obvious things if you are already well acquainted with what the line can do, but I thought it would be useful to have a little bit of a refresher. But as I started thinking more about the line and looking into the line, I came across this amazing quote by Wanda Coleman, which casts dispersion on everything I just said. Wanda Coleman says, "Does anyone remember that there was once movable type requiring the labor of typesetters and book designers et al. Who had to take time setting up and composing and actually using their hands to do more than press tabs? That poets were not always presented with proofs before their books went to press? What were the gyrations and permutations that a 19th century poet's lines underwent before being etched onto immortality? Does the, neophyte poet emerging in this century know that poets didn't always break their own lines? Who broke them and how? Are those so-called lines and enjambments that some professors of poetry wax so eloquently about truly the work of the creative writer, or rather an editor with an eye for graphic design, or a creative book designer, or more likely a creative typesetter of eras past? Does the student or lover of poetry realize that those sainted breaths set in today's literary stone weren't necessarily the work of said poet?" I love when someone casts aspersion onto something. But I bring this up not to invalidate everything that came beforehand, but to point out that Wanda Coleman's quote is perhaps a call to think of the poetic line as also a design feature, therefore not just a pattern, but also an action and a plan. I've chosen to look mostly at contemporary poets for this talk, though I think there's obviously another version of this talk where I look mostly at what dead people wrote. I say that respectfully. I'm choosing to look at contemporary poets as both an appreciation of the tough and tender work our current poets are doing, but also in the hopes that we may tune into this current now while also acknowledging there are many kinds of now. All right, so let's start. We're going to start with this poem by Vivi Francis. And I'm mostly going to go through these poems fairly quickly. I just want to point out a couple of moments in the poem that have to do with the line break. And yeah, a flight of swiftlets made their way in. And one thing I also want to acknowledge is that these are wonderful poems for other reasons, of course, too. A flight of swiftlets made their way in and settled along my cage. So expectantly beautiful their swerve. I wanted to touch them, to take their tiny frames and snap their necks. Tell me you haven't felt that way. Tell me you haven't wanted to stifle what hovers dumb before your heart. I hollowed myself into a cave for others. I opened wide as a tomb from which the stone has been rolled, and in they flew to the emptiness of me, where they made themselves a home, nested lickety-split in my walls. I have never been whole, so there was room. Now inside, I am less inclined to hurt them, but consider taking flight myself, wind-borne from some vertiginous place, why not? With so many wings within beating, 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 beating. So just a couple of features here that I want to point out. I love that there is a kind of way immediately our eyes fly to this moment right here with the way that the way that Francis has positioned beating on the page means that we can almost see both the cage as well as the opening through which that a bird might fly through. The way that Francis has used the title as a line of its own that that allows us entry into the poem right away. The way that Francis employs a monostitch as the first line, and the way that Francis has also created plenty of beautiful space here and there, but very deliberately, very mindfully, almost as if to conjure or recreate the poet's line and arc of thought. If you're not familiar with this poem, prepare to have your mind blown. This is Enough Food and a Mom by Francine J. Harris. The dad body has just enough gravy on his plate to sop up one piece of bread. So, enough for one supper, says the mom. She comes back to him, says, "Don't argue with Mom, you're a ghost." There's enough water around to drown a cob in its husk, in a dad. He puts up weather stripping all night to keep out the mom. He says, "I should have cooked for you more." She thinks she could make her own insulin to keep from going into dad. She says, "I should have married a ghost." Says, "You have a little raisin on your lip." A little. The mom says, "Stop all that quiet, it's foolish." "Come on now, Dad. Come to ghost," says the ghost. I won't even warn the mom. I won't even flinch if the ghost tries to hold her mom. After all, a good seance starts with enough food and a mom. The ghost with a biscuit and meat. The mom with the smell of cracked dad, sucked out of oxygen. Oh gosh. I got too into the poem, I lost where I am. The mom with the smell of cracked dad, sucked out of oxygen. The mom is a smell of wrecked vines. You, the dad, with no teeth. And no, the mom is a garden full of ghosts. No, says the dad, lost in ashes. No city is complete, its own worst ghost. Who can't remember the ghost now? The ghost says. All yourselves know. Now. They ghost like the bushel of a snowflower. Everyone is dead. Now, says the ghost. The mom is a yard of blackening petals. At night, I have really long dads without the ghosts. Oh gosh. At night, I have really long dads without the ghosts. What happened to the... Sorry, y'all. Okay, I have to do that part again. I have to honor that part of the poem. At night, I have really long dads without the ghosts. I wake in a puddle of ghost. But you'll be mom one day, to know I am alive. We are all sappy, Dad, aren't we? Tell the ghost it's okay. Let the bodies lie ghost for a while. I'm mom of you. I'm mom of you a lot. I just want to point out the halting stops and starts created by the period and the extra space between the stanzas, the devastation of the subject matter, a child's attempt to order and organize the relentlessness of hard circumstances in a difficult household. And I want to go back to some of these big spaces here, which are deliberate. There's a way that Harris is graphically telling us everything we need to know about how we're supposed to feel here and how the speaker themselves might feel. And I want to point out, too, that because of that punctuation, there is a sense of that haunting. The word ghost is repeated, and it makes me think of Walter Benjamin saying about Holderlin's poems that Holderlin uses an insistent, haunting caesura, which I think can also be said of Harris's poem here. So I have to admit that I had never really read William Carlos Williams before. I was like, yeah, the Plum poem, I get it. I don't know. I don't really care that much. You know, you see it around, and I would just be like, I guess that's all there is to know about him. But I found a copy of a book of his at a used bookstore in Texas called Half Price Books, And I decided to pick it up, and I ended up having a really intense big crush on William Carlos Williams after I read that book, as well as after learning more about him. In part that he joined the Imagist movement along with Pound, HD, and others as a reaction to the rigid and ordered poetry of that time, a humanistic defiance that eventually led to his famous invention of the variable foot, the idea that each line corresponds to one single breath unit. And I think that there's a very interesting convergence happening there between what Williams is doing with visual patterns as well as oral ones. And I'm not sure how many of y'all are familiar with this Williams poem. It's not one of his really famous poems, but I find it absolutely beautiful and devastating. It's called The Children. Once in a while, we'd find a patch of yellow velvet, of yellow violets. Not many, but blue, big blue ones in the cemetery woods. We'd pick bunches of them. There was a family named Foltet, a big family, with lots of children's graves. So we'd take bunches of violets and place one on each headstone. What I admire about this poem, including the variable foot and the usage of that here, but what I really admire about it is the way that this poem allows for a kind of entry into this child's world in ways that feel very digestible but very consistent and relentless nonetheless. This is mostly a poem that is composed, as you can see, of tercets, but there is this one stanza here, and most of them are about the same line length, but there's this one stanza here with a longer line, and that line happens to be, I think, one of the most devastating lines in the poem, with lots of children's graves. And the idea of these children who are alive searching for flowers to honor or celebrate children who have passed is not just devastating, but it also seems like Williams has really thought through with intention how to get us to the point in the poem where we're about 3/4 of the way through, where we can finally experience what the intention of all of that flower collecting is. This is a poem by Sebastian Paramo. I wanted to bring a little bit of Texas into the building with this poem called Lone Star. In the end, Houston will launch us into outer space once more. We'll peer at what they call the little blue engine. They'll call it Earth or a failure in the distant future. They'll tell us the story of first man, first woman, first man on the moon, first person to shape another person out of clay. God. They'll talk about the motherships and fatherships. By then, we'll have escaped the Milky Way. They'll tell us about the little things that once cradled the bigger things, our first son. They will not let us dream. They will not tell us what it means, and we won't know if this is a blessing or a curse. Eventually, another ending will come. We won't know walls because we're so far away. Our children, many generations from now, will ask, why did we leave Earth? What was the moon like? We left Mars too. Oh, our feral homeworlds. Nobody can answer our questions because they left us outside history. In a dream, I'll misremember physical laws and say, gravity is like falling in love. We don't remember the ground. We float like cosmic dust and forget everything. I'm alone on the craft now, the faded Lone Star TM. I'm writing the last remnant of Tejas. It's the end of an experiment, and distant stars won't remember my name. So what I want to say here about this poem is just that there seems to be fairly deliberate line break throughout. We mostly have couplets, a few monostitches, and I'm not going to talk about the capitalization, but I think the capitalization works here to great effect as well. But what I want to point out is this small moment at the very end where we have these two floating lines, physical laws and say gravity is like falling in love, which the tech is not working with me today, y'all. which prepare us for the ending of the poem where the speaker is floating in a vessel in outer space. There's something about these floating lines that allow us to enter into that consciousness of somebody who is alone, floating through outer space with a little bit more preparation and a little bit more clearly. Okay. Anybody have any questions while I'm doing this? I don't know. Are we back? No, I think I'm good for now. Thank you. Oh, that's my new lease for my apartment. Okay, great. All right. Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to point out that, again, about 3/4 of the way through this poem, there are these two sort of floating lines, and then just a stanza later, we actually are alone on a craft that's in the middle of outer space. And I really like how this poem sets us up to experience that aloneness with the use of the line break. Okay. This is a poem by Divya Victor from her book Curb. It's called Stoop. From here and to the left for the doctor's house, 12 minutes by foot with a backpack, and then back to check the mailbox. From here and to the right for the music teacher's house, 3 minutes by foot with the lunchbox, and then back to send the telegram. From here and to the north for the store which sells 2 patties with ketchup, 10 minutes on banana bike with empty cloth bag, and then back to buy more stamps. From here and to the south for the church with the small stone Mary, 8 minutes on moped with wine offering on lap, and then back to lick the envelopes. From here and to her feet for a dress stamp with running. So no time, so no luggage. From here and to the sky for a banyan older than this story. So no time, so no luggage. For when they veer, the fathers from here to there, far for a pittance. We veered with them, far for a memory of a hymn, at home with letters. Notice the pendulum of the stanza work here. The pendulum imitates the movements of the speakers, a choral weed that documents how immigrants and Americans navigate the liminal sites of everyday living. And this is taken from Victor's own words: lawns, curbs, and sidewalks undergirded by violence, but also constantly repaved with new possibilities of belonging. Again, if we're thinking back to what the line can do in terms of an action or a plan or a way of manifesting not just what is happening in time and space, but also what the physical reality of the speaker is. This poem does an excellent job, I think, of illustrating for us that feeling of going back and forth from one space to another in very short amounts of time. I want to point out how on the right side there are all of the timestamps, and then on the left side of the poem are the directions: here and to the left, here and to the right, here and to the north, etc. This next poem is by Marwa Hillel, and it's called Poem to be Read from Right to Left. I learned my first language second. CC, native I am mistaken for. Everywhere I go to sun and moon, like the letter lam, sound like lamb, but think like fox. Reminds me of this recurring dream being chased in a circle, like duck, duck, goose. But there were no other children. I got tired of counting the number of English words it takes to capture one in another. And this is the author's note. Poem to be read from right to left is written in a form created by the poet called the Arabic. The Arabic is a form that includes an Arabic letter with an Arabic footnote and an Arabic numerable, preferably written right to left as the Arabic language is, and vehemently rejects you if you try to read it left to right. To vehemently reject in this case means to transfer the feeling of every time the poet has heard an English as only language speaker, patronizingly utter in some variation the following phrase, "Oh, so-and-so is English as a second language," etc. I don't really have much to say. I think this poem really speaks for itself in terms of what it's doing with the line, and to use that word, to bring back that word subversive into our thinking here. I think this is just such a radical way of innovating English and innovating the line to great effect. I know I'm going through these quickly. I just want to get through all of them. Okay. I wanted to bring this poem forward, A, because of summertime, B, because it's Chen Chen, and C, because I think that this is a really terrific use of the monostitch as a choice in line. You are the ice cream sandwich connoisseur of your generation. Blessed are your floral shorteralls, your deeply pink fanny pack with travel-size lint roller just in case. Level of splendiferous in your outfit, 200. Types of invisible pain stemming from adolescent disasters in classrooms, locker rooms, and quite often Toyota Camrys, at least 10,000. You are not a Jigglypuff, not yet a Wigglytuff. Reporters and fathers call your generation the worst, which really means queer kids who could go online and learn that queer doesn't have to mean disaster or dead. Instead, queer means splendiferously you. And you means someone who knows that common flavors for ice cream sandwiches in Singapore include red bean, yam, and honeydew. Your powers are great, are growing. One day, you will create an online personality quiz that also freshens the breath. The next day, you will tell your father, "You were wrong to say that I had to change, to make me promise I would, to make me promise and promise." I already mentioned the way that the monostitch is functioning in this poem. These single lines allow these statements to become extremely personal and intimate affirmations, but Chen Chen doesn't seem content to just leave it there. Note a couple of these shorter lines, these lines that are truly devastating or dead, and then this final extremely short line, and promise. Clearly, Chen Chen had a choice and could have moved those into the body of the monostitch stanza, but instead, Chen Chen chose to create a variation in the use of the line here, and I think those two moments are sort of like the dark counterpoint to these really beautiful and loving and joyous affirmations. And I think that part of the way that I'm reading Chen Chen's use of the monostitch here is a kind of slowing down of these affirmations so that we are really able to receive them. I don't know about y'all, but I mean, I think that my experience of writers is that we're terrible at taking compliments. So I appreciate how Chen Chen slowed the line down so you can really take these affirmations in. But also the counterpoint to that, of course, are these lines that are a little bit shadowy or a little bit darker and are the reason, perhaps, for these longer lined affirmations. And now I'm just going to, let's see, I think I lost all of my tab. Okay. I just wanted to show y'all this poem by Keith S. Wilson. It's called Line Dance for an American Textbook. This is the same stanza repeated over and over again, and you can see here that Wilson has created a graphic, a way of reading this poem that I'm not going to go into much detail, but I really encourage you to go back and read it the way that he's intended it for it to be read. And you can see just on a quick scroll the work that has gone into thinking about exploding the line out of just language itself and moving into the realm of design, to go back to the Wanda Coleman quote. And I'm just going to read this stanza here that is repeated. Blood is tougher to lift from cotton than sorrow from a photo. I see the suspect country of my grandfather. I know almost nothing but fear. Is this American history? Yeah, it's so cool, right? Let's just take one more second to take it in. again, I just want to show how much work has gone into thinking about the use of the line. And I wanted to end with this final poem in this packet called The Card Tables by Jericho Brown. This is a shout out to all my spades players. But y'all don't want the smoke. That's all I'm gonna say. That's all I'm gonna say. It's called The Card Tables. Stop playing. You do remember the card tables, slick stick figures like men with low-cut fades, short but standing straight because we bent them into weak display. What didn't we want? What wouldn't we claim? How perfectly each surface was made for throwing or dropping or slamming a necessary portion of our pay. And how could any of us get by with one in the way? Didn't that bare square ask to be played? Didn't that bare square ask to be played on, beaten in the head, then folded, then put away? All so we could call ourselves safe, now that there was more room, a little more space. I just want to point out here that this is, if you missed Alicia Stallings' craft talk on the rhyme, this is sort of like one of those cross-referenced poems that I think would be useful to look at both in terms of the rhyme and line breaks, but here the line breaks are created by the rhyme. And I think that sense of rhythm that's created both by the line break as well as the sense of rhyme means that we sort of grow accustomed to the rhythm of the poem as we read it, which I think echoes or mimics the way gameplay actually is, the sort of rises and falls during gameplay, the way that once you sort of get into once you have moved past trying to learn the rules of the game, gameplay goes in such a way that, I'm sorry, all of my work, I'm so tired. I just all of the thoughts just left my head. But I guess I just wanted to point out here that these rhymes are combined with the variations in line breaks, seems to mimic and create the effects of gameplay itself. And I just want to close with a couple of final thoughts here, and thank you for your patience with me today and also with the patience with the tech. In the beginning of her live performance of Who Knows Where the Time Goes at Philharmonic Hall in New York, Nina Simone says, "Let's see what we can do with this lovely, lovely thing that goes past all racial conflict and all kinds of conflicts. Sometime in your life, you will have occasion to say, what is this thing called time? What is that? You go to work by the clock, you get your martini in the afternoon by the clock, your coffee by the clock, you get on the plane by a certain time. It goes on and on and on. Time," she says, "is a dictator as we know it." But when I consider time as a dictator, I think of it in terms of two meanings of the word. First, as a kind of fascist overlord, of course, whose thumb we are all under. And second, most importantly, to me anyway, time as a dictation, an utterance that is written down, recorded, and read aloud, which brings us, once again, back to the line. Thank you all so much.